Good morning. For those watching on YouTube, we're slightly delayed, but we'll get started in a minute. Well, let's start with somebody who's here.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, good morning. I'm Holly Stallworth. This is day 2 of the BenMap and Benefits Methods panel. I don't need to repeat my opening statement yesterday, reminding folks that we're under the Federal Advisory Committee Act. So I'm going to hand it over to the chair for our agenda.
Good morning, everybody. And today we are on the BenMap portion of the BenMap and Benefits panel. So we made great progress yesterday on the more general benefits section. And today we are just going to go straight through. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 questions related to BenMap. And so we will, as usual, take them in order. So we have a little bit less time, just to remind people. We have about 45 minutes per question. So we'll see if that, we'll take what time it needs, but we will aim for a break around 10 and see if we can get through 2 questions first. So the first of the questions, 6, like the questions that we had yesterday, most of these have several subparts. 6, 7, and 8 are like that, and then 9 and 10 are a little simpler. So we're going to start with 6, which is largely about the data sets that are used as inputs to BenMap rather than how BenMap works itself. So we assigned several of you to talk about, to look into the BenMap data sets, and we'll just go through the list, except that not everybody is here at the moment. Davin Henza is busy today, so we're going to pass over him and we'll get his input later by email. So we'll just start with those who are here. And Peter, I don't see yet, so we will turn to David Bell, please.
Yeah, hi, good morning. I guess just one overarching question I think I know the answer to, but when we're thinking about user experience, we're only commenting on the new cloud version, right? I know because it's still a work in progress and there's lots of functionality so can we draw upon our experience of the desktop version and kind of envision how that will be incorporated and kind of?
Yes, we're asking you to comment on the cloud version, but absolutely draw upon your past experience using the desktop version.
I assume a recurring theme this morning will be just, this isn't there yet, this isn't there yet. So I'll say those things and I'm sure others will as well, but that's.
We're aware.
Yeah, of course. So as far as inputs for running BenMap, a key limitation for me is in the choice of health effects studies. The user cannot select individual health effects, only the full set of mortality and morbidity effects. Moreover, unlike in the desktop version, I can't input my own health impact functions, only use those preloaded into the model. So for this and for other inputs, the cloud version of BenMap seems to lock me into an analysis path and seems to offer few opportunities to customize the analysis. So this matters to me for a variety of reasons. For having BenMap reflect the latest science, I understand the criteria for choosing health endpoints in terms of causality and biological plausibility, the things we talked about yesterday. And I also understand why the core preferred health effect studies were chosen. But one challenge that arises for me is when these endpoints and preferred studies change over time. For example, from the 2009 PM2.5 ISA to the 2019 ISA. So one thing I do as a user of BenMap is to examine how air pollution attributable health impacts change over time. So comparison to previous BenMap studies I've done. But of course, this becomes problematic when it feels like the goalposts are being moved and I don't have the capability to move them back. I think a related issue is some inconsistency with other EPA models that examine health and economic impacts of PM2.5 pollution. I do occasionally use EPA's COBRA model. I'm sure you're familiar with that. It's a reduced form model that estimates the health and economic impacts directly from criteria pollutant emissions changes. So the latest version of COBRA uses a different set of health effect studies than BenMap. Notably, it still uses for the PM 2.5 mortality results, the results from the American Cancer Society and Harvard 6 Cities cohort studies. So maybe this is more a COBRA issue than a BenMap issue, that COBRA just needs to catch up. But still, this inconsistency across models bothers me, and I would like to be able to have more flexibility to match those up. A few other input choices in the process for choosing or entering them. Air quality inputs. So the model offers a variety of pre-policy and post-policy preloaded air quality surfaces to choose from, but it's not clear to me what each option is. So it'd be good to see some more explanation of what they are. Also, the process for the user to upload, my own user-specific air quality data is not clear. And particularly, it doesn't seem like I can upload my own air quality grid shapefile if I want to use some other geographies besides the kind of the preloaded counties or the CMAQ 12-kilometer grid. One last thing in the air quality data that's not there yet, the functionality to use monitoring data that was in the desktop version. So I look forward to having that as well. In terms of population data and baseline incidence data, also, again, cannot yet divert from the preloaded options for either of those. I think this is especially important to me for incidence data, as I've done several analyses where I've used my own kind of local and regional health incidence data. So as far as, another kind of framing this question was the kind of documentation, the explanation, transparency of data choices. I'm generally satisfied with that in both the user's manual and the TSD and in the model outputs. So part E of this, what are some of the kind of talking about the limitations of the BenMap tool? Just one small thing. One limitation that the user's manual does mention is the impacts effects that BenMap does not evaluate. But it doesn't mention that because it's only looking at PM 2.5 and ozone impacts and not considering other pollutants, it's not necessarily capturing the full health and economic burdens of air pollution. So I'd like to maybe just see that mentioned somewhere. Yeah, I think that's it for me for now. I realize that probably a lot of what I said is kind of spilling over into our later questions. So I maybe tended to err on the side of saying too much now, but so I apologize if I'm jumping ahead, but those are some of my thoughts. Thank you.
And that's great. That's very much appreciated. Let us continue down the list then. We'll skip over Davin, and then online we have Ling Jin, please.
Yeah, so the previous speaker kind of touched upon a lot of things I noticed. I just want to add to going from the A to E order about the input data. Currently, we have a default data. If you go to the data center, what you find is your model outputs and the model inputs in terms of the AQ surface, either user uploaded or the predefined. I wonder if since the data sets, to make it fully transparent, we should include all these data elements, including starting from a grid definition, which is the shape files of even the 12-kilometer, as well as a user define. If they have their own a metadata, they should be able to upload there so that the subsequent users can reuse it or check it. The incidence and prevalence rates used currently, population data set, I understand it can be quite a lot. So some of these can use external storage rather than on a cloud base. But at least some link, external link should be provided. Then the health impact functions, you can get those after you run the model, the web tool from the log file. But it could be beneficial, like if you have like a centralized place to put the data there, as well as variable data sets like a socioeconomic demographic data, inflation, valuation functions, and income growth adjustment. So those data sets ideally can be provided in the data center, so that people can, like if they want to further diagnose their model outputs by like poking in different dimensions, like why this is happening and how to explain or disentangle the difference between two different runs. They could go back to the input data and to evaluate like what's the drivers behind those differences. About B indicated, the inputs are generally well documented. I'm very impressed with the documentation. I know how hard it is for a tool like complex like this to document each little details. But the web tool is, to me, is like a really simplified without adequate documentation on the fly. Like when you click through, it would benefit from like a little eye information icon there to remind you what you are looking at. I had to like hold like a 300-page user manual and going back and forth to see like what I'm doing, like exactly what the choices means. It could benefit from some simple explanation, such as the population choices, valuation function choices. About C, again, there's extensive documentation on the literature value and the preparation process for the default data used. I want to add to just follow the discussion from yesterday, the accuracy of the population data, which is based on 2010 census at the block level. We know that ACS has like a 5-year or yearly data, as well as we have new 2020 census data available now. So I wonder if the accuracy of the population data can be benchmarked with like over a decade data record observed. This is also a way to evaluate the Woods and Pool forecast used in the population data. Also, as mentioned yesterday, like potentially include upstream air quality model performance to judge its quality, because that's the missing piece. Like even what's the data included downstream of within the map was documented. The upstream input data in terms of air quality surface is not. The AQS monitoring data is not currently implemented. But once it's implemented, I would wonder like how the tool can make use of data of different like collection frequencies, like hourly data versus like a daily PM 2.5 versus weekly, like how those time resolutions are resolved and whether there will be guidance on that. Some other questions, this is probably also related to item D, is that I did prepare my own air quality surface data to run on this web tool. So what I'm doing is to really trying to understand how it works and also stress test the system, like use some extreme cases. For example, I didn't have the national data. So I use California, my modeling domain, and zero out other places to see if it will create some funky results. So the challenges, I'll talk about the challenges in the user experience, but this is related to E. So I'm going to talk about C and D. I do have some questions about the data and parameter used, and as well as the CR functions used. The first one is when the input data is the metric provided as daily maximum 8-hour ozone. It seems a lot of the effects, the health effects, are still computed for the 1-hour maximum ozone. Like, I wonder how that conversion was done, given that the user only provided 8-hour max. There's some documentation about how to convert 1-hour max to 8-hour max, but not vice versa. I did do some back of envelope calculation and convert 8-hour back to the 1-hour that output from the model, and it seems the conversion factor is the same. So I wonder if that should be documented, that this conversion is bidirectional rather than like unidirectional. About the health endpoints for ozone, it is not clear to me how to adjust the CR function for annual versus warm season ozone. It's in particular, this is not clear for quantifying acute health effects, because for mortality, the studies cited are all from warm season, whereas for mobility, some of them are from like a whole year and for annual basis, and some of them from a warm season, whereas the AQ surface is probably only provided for either warm season or annual basis. So I wonder, like, given that, how is BenMap internally adjust the CR functions to account for that, or doing some internal conversions to make the input appropriate? Yeah, and then lastly, for item E, when I try to create my own AQ surface, I had challenges first to convert a different grid resolution to match the 12 grid definition. EPA staff has been very helpful to provide me with the shape files, so that made it easy. And the conversion can be done with a very simple R script. I wonder if like EPA has a place for the user to contribute to a GitHub or something, so that the common analysis script can be used by other members of the research community. The other challenge is that there's some inconsistency in the description of the user manual in terms of the column names and the variables in the annual metric. So the consistency comes from the choices in the annual metric versus the web version. When you click the example data, the annual metric column actually showed 8-hour maximum, which is not the choice appeared in the user manual. So if we use the example as our default template, we actually get an error message when we upload our data to the website. So so that should be fixed, so that what user sees in the example data sets should be consistent with the user manual explanation. Yeah, that's all from me.
Thank you. The very Very useful comments. I should remind people that we should try to keep to kind of relatively high level comments, and given the time limit and we can come back later to focus on the very kind of fine grained.
Yeah, I err on the side that I
details.
say too much for the first part.
I know
It would be like overlapping then later.
Well, it's very useful and it applies to all, I think, all of the BenMap related questions. But yeah, we do want to generally keep our attention up at kind of the higher level use of BenMap rather than too much about any specific detail. But thank you. That's great. Why don't we go to Michael Kleeman, also online, please?
Hi, good morning. And thanks to the previous two speakers. A lot of what they said, I think, resonated with me very strongly. Ling, hats off to you for actually succeeding in uploading data files. I never made it that far once I realized how limited it was. So I'll just try to add new comments and things that I've been highlighting that other speakers haven't said already. So in terms of the data, transparency and appropriateness, I think that we should favor open source population and demographic data so that it's very transparent to the users where that's coming from. The woods and pool projection being proprietary and sort of a black box, is the focus of that comment. And then, I also believe, and I want to repeat this, that limited functionality of the web tool is a real impediment for researchers to continue using BenMap to, answer innovative research questions that I think would benefit EPA. And so I really do believe that the current version of BenMap, the BenMap CE model, should be fully supported until all of that functionality has been translated over into the web-based tool. Because again, I think that EPA derives a lot of benefit from the innovations that researchers come up with and the ways that they use that model. And so it's to EPA's benefit, I believe. In terms of the, the health functions that are available, obviously we want the flexibility to be able to enter our own health functions when there's something new and cutting edge comes out. But it would also be helpful for me, maybe as someone who doesn't focus necessarily on that research topic, to have some sort of a rating system in the EPA sort of staff, sort of a ranking or some sort of a quality indication. I was an advocate for let's not throw out studies and let's not just pick the best studies to use in the model. But that being said, if we put all of the good studies in there, I still would like some sort of a ranking from EPA staff, like an expert opinion, just even a scale of 1 to 10, so that when I look at the in some cases, many different health impacts that are estimated, how should I prioritize them? How should I look at them? So some sort of a quality indication, expert opinion from EPA staff would be welcome in that area. I was struck by some of the comments yesterday, and maybe this is something that I learned from this process, how to interpret the value of a statistical life. And the comment was that we are, judging that largely based on working age people, but then many of the health impacts happen to older people. So we're kind of transferring that. Different regions of the country may actually have, different values, but we use an average value to sort of go across the whole country to try to smooth that out a little bit. I was struck by, I had been thinking about this, that I could just divvy up the population into different race or ethnicity groups and sort of when I can calculate the sort of expected mortality for each of them, I can use that same VSL value to sort of put a monetary value on that I can then compare to other things. But perhaps that isn't appropriate. I mean, maybe that's not the best use of the VSL metric to sort of divvy it up into portions that way. And so I was struck by that, and maybe there should be some recognition of that, maybe a warning to users like me who are not quite as sophisticated in terms of understanding the nuances of that VSL and how it should be applied. So maybe that could be a part of the documentation as well. And then finally, I am an advocate for using this tool at high spatial resolution. I think that we want to be able to do the environmental justice type calculations at something more fine-grained than 12 kilometers. And again, there may be a point at which it breaks down. I'm not sure that applying this tool at 100-meter resolution over a limited area, whether that would violate some of the assumptions inherent in the epidemiology that's the basis for the model, or a wise interpretation of the health impacts. And so again, I'm an advocate for something finer grained than 12 kilometers, but again, maybe, as I just said, with the VSL and how to interpret it, there should be a little bit of a warning to the user. Maybe there should be a warning about the reasonable lower limit or the spatial scope of the application of the model, so that researchers like me who want to try to push it to its limits maybe understand where those limits are a little bit better. So those are my comments. I think that maybe are outside of what the previous two speakers, their excellent summaries.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Michael. We are going to go next to Dr. Neptune, please.
Yeah, I was a totally naive user, and my kind of experience was that I clicked on everything that was possible to click on to see if there were kind of points of kind of maximal transparency to inform exactly what was going on. And Dr. Jen's, I think, experience, which is surprising, very much kind of reconcile with my own, where I was constantly looking for kind of the little eye icon or links so that I could explore kind of the data set, or I could explore kind of the health effects. And even to the point of just having links to the primary data or primary references. And I found that I was too often kind of playing around with the BenMap user's manual. And I always see that as a signature of a problem when I'm totally attached to the user's manual for anything that is supposed to create kind of a facile experience. And so in terms of the health effects, which I kind of drilled down on, my major concern was how easy it would be to input new data, more current data into the system and have it appropriately kind of clarified or made very granular. And that's, I think, the charge of the user's experience. And I'm very kind of excited to understand exactly how easy that is going to be. And the last thing I think that we need to kind of separate would be the experience of people who are working with this from a regulatory posture as opposed to a research posture. And how is it best to delineate what are the attributes of the tool that would serve one group as opposed to the other, and which are the ones that are beneficial to both groups. And I think that consideration has to go into the further development of this tool. I did not play around kind of with the prior, much more kind of extensive version, but I do feel I kind of understand the cloud version and how it's supposed to be used.
Thank you. Next, we have Jonathan Patz, please.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add from these very complete presentations. We also play around with Cobra, and that was we had the same question about the data used, the CR functions used, and that it's not well documented why when the American Cancer Society and the Harvard Six Cities study has been the main points of evidence in the previous version. I know that Pope et al. Has revised and reanalysis, but it's just not indicated why those other ones were dropped. It should be more explicitly described that yes, we've moved on from there, and there are better data sources. Like Enid, finding everything was in the user the manual, the user manual, but not on, the data that came out on the cloud version is not obvious. You click on it and it's just the cloud version doesn't give you much information. You have to go back to the user manual. So same, just reemphasizing that. And then everything else was covered. I just want to also emphasize the issue of the grid resolution that I'll just say, again, I'll add on to the other 2 or 3 speakers that have said the exact same thing, that you're intentionally limiting 12-kilometer resolution, and it's got to be nationwide. Well, of course, we're going to be looking at smaller resolution, different areas. And I did notice in your manual that you said, this is on page 5-2, quote, future versions will accept custom air quality files at the US national, state, and county levels as well. Future versions will also enable you to first upload a GIS shapefile in order to define custom grid. So great. Really important, and it'd be nice to know when that can happen. But that was one of the shortcomings. Other people have said the exact same thing. So my comments are pretty much in line with the others.
Yeah, I agree. We're getting a lot of parallels across these comments, but it's very useful to know that and to hear that different members of the panel had similar opinions. We have 2 more, please. That would be Christy next online.
Yeah, hi. I agree with all of what's already been said, and also coming at this, not as a BenMap user, so I don't have experience with the previous tool. So really just coming at this to, from in some ways, I think a layperson's perspective in a way. And so, I first want to say that the user manual, I think, is really beautifully written, and made me want to become an economist or, a modeler of some sort. Like, I thought it was actually really explanatory. For me personally, it just felt like a wonderful experience to read it, actually, even the 300 pages of it. So I want to give you all kudos for that. But I also felt like, so for part A on the data input, transparency and appropriateness, others have already said very similarly, I found myself really wanting to be able to click on a link or, to have an evidence map, for example. I mean, I found myself really coming back to the systematic review types of processes that IRIS and other parts of, EPA are utilizing, but really being able to see not only what's included as the inputs for being able to to do this work, but also the things that are excluded and why. And so I think that there are lots of tools, especially as you're moving into this cloud-based format, that would allow you to integrate really easily to, say, a Tableau evidence map that would allow folks to be able to interrogate and interact with the studies, for example, that are being utilized. So just something to add there as a potential step forward. I also found myself being really surprised by the limited number of inputs for part B. So again, I'm coming at this without a lot of background in this space, but it just felt really constrained walking through the various pathways. So you only had one choice for some things or limited numbers of choices for other things. And so I thought that, but this has already been commented on by folks that are experts with this model, so I won't go into that more deeply. Let's see. So most of the other things, again, like the underlying data used, I think, again, it would be good to be able to have some interactivity so folks can really explore that underlying data. For the CR functions, again, like you had to go back and forth between the user manual and, the tool or go into the literature yourself in order to understand some of that. So I found that was a bit difficult. And then for part E, I also, again, was looking for places in which to upload data. So I'm glad that Dr. Jing is here and was able to do that too. But I also found myself really trying to think about this from a community perspective as well. So who are the users that you think might be utilizing this? But I'd love to, see some examples of the ways in which you could upload, locally collected data. So again, we have a lot of effort that's going on right now on communities or, other folks in very small geographic regions doing hyperlocal air quality monitoring. And I'd like to see, instructions on how one might do that or how you interpret the data. And so Again, I thought that the user manual was really nicely, I mean, again, it was accessible in my opinion. And I think that if the agency could also think about creating little modules or toolkits for folks that, across an entire spectrum that might want to interact with this model in a way that might help them answer very specific questions in their specific areas, I think would also be really wonderful. So just building on, I think, the excellent work that was done in designing that user manual to increase the usability by giving little ways for folks to be able to input their own data and explore the outputs in ways that are meaningful to them.
Thank you, Christy. So we're going to loop back around to Peter, please.
Okay. So I've never been a direct hands-on user of BenMap, although I've had students use it pretty commonly. So some of my comments are limited. I did survey colleagues, students, former students who've been hands-on users to get some of their input. The charge question around transparency, I thought it was okay. I did an exercise of thinking through what I think the key values are that go in to these sorts of calculations. And I was able to sort of see what they were and what the choices were. I'll note that I did that, entirely by scrolling through the pages and the pages of the appendices. And I think it's very important that all those appendices be there. So I think those were well done. I didn't think about what other people said about having things sort of more interactive online. I endorse that suggestion. I want to step back and make kind of and really echo a broader point about how valuable the BenMap tool is, outside the walls of EPA. As someone who is a, chemical engineer, air quality modeler, I don't claim any particular economics or health expertise. For me and lots of people like me, as we at some point in our career started to translate the modeling into health endpoints, it was so valuable to, to the credibility of the publications and everything to be able to say, we're using BenMap, it's EPA standard. And so it's a hugely valuable thing. So one is a thank you. And then the second that comes along with that is a plea, which is, I think, it's really important to support the use of BenMap by people outside EPA. I totally get that first and foremost, it's a regulatory impact and it has to meet EPA's priorities in that context. And there can be no sort of compromise or negotiation around that. That makes 100% sense to me. But I'd like to just kind of hear in a more reassuring way that EPA really does want to support the weird and varied uses that researchers might put it through that may not be, appropriate in a regulatory impact. And I'll echo what a lot of other, and so maybe I've misinterpreted, but I felt a certain sense of caginess or sort of, well, I don't know if we can totally commit, and I appreciate the resource constraints. But other people have said that I think it's really in the EPA's interest. It's certainly in the research community's interest, but also in the EPA's interest to have BenMap be a robust tool. Specifically on that, some things that people called out to me, and this might be going beyond question 6, but this is my chance to talk, is the importance of batch processing and having a really robust batch processing tool that's computationally efficient, and whether there are certain calculations that can be saved and reused or whatever. Ted mentioned yesterday that, Monte Carlo doesn't always have to be, repeated. It can be pre-computed or done analytically in ways that probably save a lot of time. And I'll echo what Mike Kleeman has said a few times just about the importance of not losing functionality in version transitions. That's everything.
Thank you, Peter. And thanks everybody for charge question 6 comments. Do we have other comments from the floor at the moment from anybody who wasn't assigned? Yes, Lisa.
So I actually was going to bounce something. Wait a second. By the time we leave, I'll be pushing buttons every time I want to talk, and there won't be a mic there.
it's really exciting to me to be on these sort of cross-disciplinary panels, and where I learn a lot from the people who do different things from what I do, and I hear a lot of enthusiasm for the things that I do. And Christy, welcome to the club. We're going to bring you on board anytime you want to join us. But I just want to make sure that the panel members know that in the share, whatever it's called, SharePoint files, I downloaded a bunch of background documents on benefit cost analysis, particularly in the regulatory context. There's a bunch of guidance documents that talk about how EPA and other agencies do benefit cost analysis for regulations. Add some other documents that are just, and all of them have sort of simple introductory level discussions of these issues. There's also a separate file that's reviews of the literature, evaluation literature that's incomplete, but it was what I sort of put my hands on quickly. I teach VSL and benefit cost analysis all the time, and I don't know if this is common for SAB, but I'd be happy to just do my little dog and pony show for anybody in this group on Zoom whenever you want. I mean, it's easy for me because actually some of you have taken my class, but some of you taught in my class with me, but it'd be easy for me to do, and that might be a way of helping folks. On Michael's point, BenMap has been used or can be used to enter different VSL values and to distinguish them in all kinds of different ways. I think the reason why we're talking so much about average values today is that, and yesterday, is that our charge is to think about the use of BenMap for regulatory impact analysis. And that's where we use the official EPA estimates, and we don't distinguish by age, race, location, or any of these other factors. In fact, Neil Fan, who actually I don't know if Michael can even see him, but Neil's used BenMap for some things that look at I'm gonna misspeak now, Neil, but to look at distributional issues and other sorts of things. That's it.
Thank you. I don't see any hands at the moment, so I would like to, yes, I do see, I just wasn't looking. Thank you for pointing. Rob, let's go
So,
over here, please.
I just wanted to make a couple of additional comments about the value of BenMaps to the research community. And I make the comments because Dr. Sasser's here in the room. And yeah, I think that proposal's going to be close to dead on arrival after hearing yesterday from Pete the kind of resource constraints that you're under. So I think I'd like to just pitch it in a little different way. There's a lot of enthusiasm here. I think that people would be quite interested in a users group, and a way to frame it might be not so much in terms of the research community's needs as in terms of EPA's needs. And there have been at least a half dozen questions that have come up in the last day that you guys need an answer to. And the sort of broader community could give you that answer. So if you framed it in that way, then you might be able to get some of the resources that you need to make this work. And the second half of that would be that my experience is that it's quite hard to get funding for this kind of work out sort of in the research community. NIH doesn't want anything to do with it. And so, this could be a niche that EPA could fill with a big RFA potentially that would bring together a community to really look at EPA's needs in this area and answer questions like that. So that's my pitch.
Very welcome, Rob. Jonathan.
I was just going to say I like that because I've been thinking along the similar lines, and also sort of following a bit more of an open access model with the code and underlying data. And I realized like between the two of us, we kind of converged on the idea. So there's there's a big user community around CMAC, which is also part of the regulatory monitoring chain. So I think a lot of this you could just mimic like the CMAS center for BenMap, and that would do a lot. Does that sound right? Okay. I had a second comment too, just on things to customize as well. I've seen some. I think it'd be nice to kind of have the capacity to add custom pollutants alongside of ozone and PM 2.5. I think the coolest application of this that I saw was somebody presented work where they used PM 2.5 as a proxy for pollen and modeled like increased incidence of allergies with climate change with the expected increase in pollen. So very useful for the research community, just to echo that.
Super. I have two questions as well. And the first one is for the EPA staff here, which is that it seems to me from what I've been hearing that there are some things like, you could potentially hire an intern to go in and make the user manual linked online, which would make it very easy for everybody. It's straightforward. There are things like the shape files, which you already have planned, right? So these are technically quite feasible. I wonder, not knowing what's on the back end, how feasible is it to allow users to input their own exposure response function, right? And the reason I ask is because yesterday, for example, the GEM function came up, but that's not a single equation, right? It's a whole series of models. So have you thought about this issue?
So we anticipate, resources and timing considered allowing users to input custom functions in a way that is similar to the functions that are currently there with your own parameters. We aren't currently planning further than that. That's not on our current development plan.
Okay, thank you, Peter. That's very helpful. And this, Peter.
Yeah, I mean, on that suggestion, Drew, where something is like more complicated than the usual concentration response function, I've had students sort of hack BenMap in different ways, where they want to do something that doesn't quite fit in. They've been able to pull like, okay, well the parts that I don't want to have to replicate, the population data files and so on, they grab all those pieces and then they write their own code to do the part that like BenMap can't do. But so there's probably ways in some cases, depending on the nature, that the research community can do some of the weirder things, just sort of piggybacking off of key inputs and things like that, as long as all those input files are just, CSV or easily readable and that kind of thing.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Okay, that fits with kind of what Jonathan was saying about open source, collaboration by taking the bits that you want. And so this seems like I'm just trying to avoid us, giving a list of recommendations, some of which are completely impractical. My second question then, not to the EPA staff, but to us, is in particular to David, Ling, and Ted, right? You in particular, Ted, were not actually asked to look at 6, but the 3 of you are also asked to look at 8. And it might just be me, but when I look at the user experience, it feels to me like we've actually been, to a great extent, discussing the user experience just now. So I wonder if you think that we should perhaps try to slightly reorganize not the charge questions itself in the final document, but our discussion right now to kind of merge the 2 discussions at the moment. So that's to the 3 of you, if you think we should have a separate discussion on 8 or we should kind of combine these. Ted, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I think actually I was ready to say some things in 6, but I said that they might belong in 8 or 5 and they might belong in 8, whatever. So yeah, I think there is some reason to discuss it. And just one of the things I will say I would have added to the list is being able to use like netcdf files. If you're going to tie it to CMAC, you know, I do not want to have to go through and take a netcdf, put it into CSV. And I found that, I started that, but decided no. And I just think that would be a good thing. Also, in terms of the user experience, you know, in terms of the user's manual and maybe in terms of how the software checks things, you need units. Lots of, you know, in all the tables, things like that. They don't have units, and some models use ppm and microgram per meter cubed even for ozone. And so you can see that without having that sort of check, life could be different. I mean, hopefully it would be obvious with the outputs. And in terms of needing to be able to conduct a novel analysis, you can to a limited degree. Actually, it really gets back to what other people have said about needing different concentration response functions and units. In terms of also on the user experience, looking at the user's manual, it doesn't have an example of the valuation results. You know, and so you don't, and actually it doesn't really get into what you do. You know, look at these results, they come out, what they mean, and how you might interpret them. I think that would be, you can go into the user's manual and TSD to sort of figure that out, but it's not really in the user manual itself. And where it does have a figure of the outputs, it's totally unreadable. Even if you go into the PDF, at least I couldn't get it, couldn't read it. And I think the rest that I've got are in response to some other questions, but then there's all the other things people have said.
That's terrific, Ted. And that does seem to complement the kind of discussion we've just been having, which is, as I was saying, to my mind, at least, a lot of it is about the user experience and trying to do things like novel analysis that several of you brought up. So I wonder if either David or Ling have additional comments that they were thinking of for 8, but that might be brought into this joint. So David, you want to go first and then Ling?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I think it makes sense to merge 6 and 8 together. I do have some additional thoughts that I put under number 8. Do you want me to go ahead and kind of get into those now? Okay. So the lack of mapping functionality is kind of a big limitation for me at this point. I know that's coming. But this is kind of the ability to integrate, you know, attributable impacts calculations with then being able to map those results is to me what makes BenMap more useful than just doing those calculations on a spreadsheet. So, so that I hope that comes soon. That's certainly a big limitation for me. You know, we talked a lot about other functionality not yet incorporated in our, you know, just previous discussion. One thing that wasn't mentioned was the pooling functionality is not there yet. I think that's also pretty important. We talked about lack of information about choices as you move through the modeling process. I have things to say about that here, but I think that was already all covered. One thing that the application or potentially novel analysis that is mentioned in the user's manual is the ability to investigate the total health burden of air pollution. So that in addition to just a kind of a small air quality change resulting from a specific policy or action, I think that's an important application of BenMap, which I have done in my own work. But there's no guidance in the manual about how to do that. So I think that would be useful to have a kind of in addition to kind of guide the user how to do that. Kind of one other kind of maybe minor nit is that you seem to get timed out of the model very quickly. And I need to keep relogging in and get the authorization code. And I also seem to kind of lose any work in progress if I haven't completed a task. So if there's any way to kind of fix that, that would be nice. Yeah, I think other things that were also already said for question 6, but so a few additional thoughts for that. Thanks.
Wonderful. Ling, Do you have any additional thoughts related to question 8 that we can bring in?
Yeah, I really appreciate previous speakers' experience. I like to add maybe one more is the clicking through valuation function. I found that if you don't edit the valuation function, the model would simply output just the health effects, not without monetizing them. So I found that after play around like many times, like almost ready to write up like acute effects won't be evaluated. But then I found out by default it's not evaluated. You have to click through all the functions, like make selections. I wonder if like since you are providing, like dumping us with all this information, like sometimes the 77 metrics where health endpoints are evaluated, why not by default you monetize all of them instead of us, like if we want to monetize all of them, we have to click through like all close to 100 functions. So by defaulting, and you allow user to have all the information and they could do post analysis to select instead of like if they want to default into clicking, they have to do all the work. So that's just one suggestion about setting up what you want to default to, what you don't. Yeah, I like my other comments are overlapped with others pretty much. Oh, the other thing to add is the output table. Some description of the variable names would be useful. Like other speakers mentioned the inputs, but also the outputs. There's very little description of that. The other thing is I noticed in the output table, there are mean value as well as the point estimates being both reported. I wonder if EPA could give some guidance on like which one is preferred to use. They're similar but not identical. That's all from me.
Thanks very much. That's very helpful. So any other comments, or I was thinking we might try to organize our next steps on 6 and 8 simultaneously. Okay, to my mind, it's a little bit confusing sometimes to.
I was just going to
go
point
ahead.
out some of what Ling just said also addresses question 7 and about outputs, and I'm wondering if even kind of adding 7 to this merger as well is warranted. Just a thought.
Yeah, that's right. That one was from 7. Probably read from that.
Yeah, let's see. It's essentially the same team that we've just heard from on 6. But you're right, there are some distinct questions in 7 as well. Yeah. Well, it's a little, it seems that there is some similarity, let's say, between some of the way some of these questions are posed. So where does that leave us?
While we're deliberating, I had a question, like a comment that fits somewhere in 6 to 7 or 8 that maybe I could say. So there's currently kind of a change that's happening in how we educate the types of people that are going to be your users. So in my college, in the university, we have this kind of big initiative everywhere to be adding computation into the curriculum. So like, using Python and R and these different programming environments, and like understanding how to use GitHub and things like that. And I know I talked to Peter yesterday, and they have the same thing. I've talked to people at Berkeley, and they're doing the same thing. So it seems like it's kind of this trend, right, where the universities are graduating people that have the skills to interact with these systems on the level of the source code. And so one thought would be just to be aware that, I tell these people, so I teach one of their classes, and I tell them that there are jobs for them. So one thing is that, you could think about like hiring some of these people. They could be called like environmental data scientists that could kind of sit in between the contractors that you hire to write the code and then the users, right? They'll find that like if you have some of these computational skills, that doing something like making a map of the tools, if you have the access to the kind of underlying source code, is just a couple lines of code, and you don't have to write a whole like kind of interface to make the map, right? So that's kind of one thing, is to maybe to think about shifting kind of as like a general thing, to shift to, think about that type of user as a new user, people like directly interfacing with your source code. And because of that, I think it makes sense to start thinking more about documenting the source code. So currently there's, this 300-page user manual. And if you look in the source code for this, the BenMap cloud server, there are like the people that are writing it are putting some comments about what the code does in there, but it kind of seems like they're maybe not directed to like really emphasize that, right? To say like, in the source code, like you have a function, what is this function doing? What are the inputs? What are the outputs? And any other kind of information that is necessary. And then like also, you can start documenting, like if you look at the GitHub repository, like where are the, how is it organized? Like what do the different parts do? And then you can start to get at automated ways to answer some of the questions that people have been bringing up, where you can have these kind of automated documentation systems that pulls the documentation directly from the source code and displays it on a website that you can then link to from the web tool itself. So if there's, you can have your information button that says, go to this specific like sub page of the documentation website to learn more, right? So then you get kind of the documentation is integrated with the source code and it's integrated with a tool. And then kind of beyond that, once you have all this documentation kind of built into your source code, then it's relatively straightforward to package that source code and the documentation into an open source library that you can then release, so the other people can just install it with like some sort of package manager and use it. And so we have, we're currently forcing our sophomores to learn how to download these open source packages and use them, not for health impacts, but it could be, right? We definitely, like if that existed, we would make them do it. And so then once you have that, where you can kind of directly interact with the software on the level of the functions of the software, you kind of open up all kinds of like a kind of this combinatorial space of opportunities for people to interact with it. So Peter was saying that he has students that are hacking InMap, or hacking BenMap to do the things that they need to do, like implementing the gem function. And that becomes much easier if it's kind of organized in a way that facilitates that. So like the minimum would be probably like including a database schema, which I didn't see in the documentation, but like that would be kind of like the first step of like, you have this database, which is like, it's a gold mine, right? But doesn't necessarily have a documentation about what the different rows are, or what the different like tables are, and what the different columns are, and things like that. So that'd be like the first thing. But then kind of beyond that, just like thinking about a class of user that would be interested and able to interact directly with the source code, and then even like implement some of the functionality that you don't have the resources to do, because once people you can just implement it and put it on their own thing on GitHub, and then that it's available for other members of the communities.
Thank you, Chris. I wonder if those who were assigned to 7, which is again David, Ling, this time also Jonathan and Michael online, have additional issues that came to mind when thinking of number 7, since we've heard that that's already also come into the mix a little bit here with some thoughts on there. So maybe it would make sense to get everything on the table for 6, 7, and 8, and then we can discuss how best to move forward to drafting our response to these 3 somewhat interlinked charge questions. So any, Michael, Ling, Jonathan, David, anything additional on 7 that you'd like to put forward?
I would just say that I do not have any additional comments that have not already been discussed either by myself or other members for 7. Great.
Thank you, Michael. David, I see a hand right here.
Yeah, just maybe a couple quick things about outputs. Some of what Ling said about kind of some more identification of what those outputs are. One thing she didn't say though is some more kind of clarity about the geographic units, some like geographic identifiers in the output data. We have a column and a row, which pretty sure correspond to FIPS code, like state and county FIPS codes. But if we could have state and county names in there as well, that would be really useful and simplify things. Some of the demographic disaggregation of the results, I think this is more an issue with the health impact functions and an output presentation issue. But we talked a lot about demographic stratification of the data used for quantifying the health effects yesterday by age, sex, race, ethnicity. But I see almost none of that disaggregation in the model outputs. For almost all of the results, it says all races, all ethnicities. So again, maybe that's not something that is a technical issue with the model, but that's just inherent in the kind of the way the things are calculated. But those are just a couple thoughts.
Thank you. Anything additional from Jonathan or Ling? Jonathan?
I'll just say I had some students look into this and they thought there was good documentation on all the calculations. So no, nothing to raise there.
Great. That's good to know. Ling, anything else at the moment on number 7?
I would like, as a modeler, right? Because our publications always, the first question is like how well your model performs. I wonder, like a simple benchmark of the web tool could be the comparison of its calculations with the more widely used desktop version along the way, like for the further transition. So that each output is benchmarked by the previous version of desktop version to make sure the transition doesn't lead to like unexpected discrepancies. So that's just one suggestion, like some appendix could be dedicated to ensure that the researchers, the user group knows that what they are getting is not far away from what they used to get. Yeah, that's.
Okay, thanks very much. And I see Scott Spack has joined us, so good welcome. And we're happy to hear your thoughts actually on 7 and 8, since we're having a bit of a broad discussion on how users are finding the documentation and the user experience and understanding the technical capabilities of BenMap. So go ahead, Scott.
Sure. For 7E, potential biases or uncertainties, there's been a great discussion on the focus on uncertainties in the health data and valuation, and less so so far on the population estimates, the air quality grids, the population projections, and then the net uncertainties. And so we focus a lot on the uncertainties of the science stuff, and everything else. It is what it is. And if future work can focus on the potential biases and uncertainties in the net results, I think that is an area of great benefit. The census data have documented uncertainties, and if moving to American Community Survey data for population estimates, they include directly the margin of error for each metric for each location, and the ability to propagate uncertainties in those other inputs the same way that you could propagate uncertainties in the beta function so far. That would be great. And I think there's a community role for that, as well as an agency role for regulatory purposes. But so far, those potential biases have not been indicated. There's not appropriate user notices. We're just expected to know that those things could be done, but we're not doing them. Thanks.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And we had not really, we had a little bit of a discussion heading that way yesterday on the uncertainties, but this is not in the context of BenMap, so it's very helpful. Okay, so it's Ted.
Yeah, just adding the question 7A, results are correctly calculated, giving the technical descriptions. Resounding not sure in terms of how the uncertainty is propagated and actually calculated. We were talking about this ahead of time, and going through the appendices, you have Appendix K, I think it is, and it discusses it to a limited degree, but really doesn't go into enough detail in terms of, it's not evident in terms of, are you calculating the uncertainty on a grid by grid basis and how you sum those up, and how all that's propagated. So I think that that's something that has to be documented better, and just to make sure that we know that that it's being done correctly. So right now it's sort of it's a not sure, and maybe some doubts. So just something needs to be done there.
Yeah, that's a great point. When Chris was talking about making some of this, the back end open source, I was thinking, oh, that would actually be very useful to, otherwise I'm not sure how you answer a question like 6D, are they appropriately implemented? And 7A, are they appropriately correctly calculated? I don't know.
And I will add, when you start adding like some different concentration response functions, I'm not sure that the current way that they do the Monte Carlo, you would have to change things, I think, just in terms of the current implementation. So
Okay.
that's something to keep in mind.
Yeah, when it gets to the uncertainties, you're right. Much more clarity would probably help. Chris?
I just have maybe a clarifying question. So I remember talking to Rick Burnett, or him giving a presentation maybe 6 years ago, where he was talking about how he's going under what he considered to be a very constraining effort to implement concentration response functions that could go into BenMap. So he wasn't he's saying we can't do any multivariate sampling or whatever, that it's just a function. But And so that's like where gem came from, where it's just one function, but it's still not in BenMap. So I guess the question was like, if we're, you know, if we're giving you all these recommendations about like the different ways that you could implement gem in BenMap, is that going to be useful, or is it just like you're pretty relatively focused on the kind of this just a single beta value?
I could try to answer that. So gem is implemented in the desktop version of the program. We haven't pulled it in for a variety of reasons to the web-based version of the program, principally because at this point of the process, we're focused on performing analyses for EPA's regulatory applications. Having said that, because Rick went through all the work to make sure that the gem could actually be parameterized for BenMap and EQBAT, which is the Canadian benefits tool, there's no reason in principle that we couldn't pull it in. So.
Great. Well, we have, as I see it, we have a couple of options. One is that we start going through sub point by point, if that's what these things should be called. There are 14 subsections to charge questions 6, 7, and 8. And we could simply go through them in order and try to assign a lead person and to each one. We could potentially take a break 8 minutes early and use part of that break to try to think for those who are involved in 6, 7, and 8 about perhaps bottom-up organization of how they might think it, if there's a more efficient way to organize this than just going through those 14 one by one. I see that there's a lot of overlap, and I think that the discussion has confirmed that there is a lot of overlap, but that doesn't necessarily make it obvious to me which ones might be combined with others, or how best to ensure that, you know, something like 8A, can the user make appropriate analytic choices, right? And that seems very similar in many ways to 6A and B. But I don't know if that's a more productive way to try to make a smaller number of groupings. It might make the lead person's life easier rather than having to have leads of 3 separate things and then try to harmonize them afterwards if one person was in charge of things that were quite similar. And it seems to me that a couple of these about, you know, the technical results, like we were just talking about, like 6D, which talks about the implementation, and 7A, which talks about the technical implementation, that those might logically be handled efficiently by the same person. Some of the others about documentation, you know, come up in 6D, for example, and then 7B, and then 8D, which are all in some sense, you know, is it clear to the user what's going on? So I don't know, show of hands of people who would think it would be useful to have a little break period pondering about how to proceed, or would people prefer to just start going through? Peter?
I think your suggestion of trying to cluster these into a smaller number and to avoid diverging opinions on kind of the same question, I think
Makes
a lot of
sense.
sense.
Okay. Okay, I'm seeing an informal nodding of heads, which is probably easier than a show of hands. So why don't we do that if that's acceptable to everybody? We're supposed to have a break in 6 minutes anyway, right? So we could start a moment, you know, a few minutes early. We could still come back at 10:15, which gives us 20 minutes, and people can, you know, stretch their legs. People can come back here and engage Ling and Michael and Scott, who are all online. And we can all try to see if, we spend a few minutes thinking about 6, 7, and 8 if we can come up with ways to cluster, and then maybe at 10:15 we can see if there's any overlap in the clusters that various people have come up with. We come up either independently or together. Any other comments? Okay, so let's break now, and we'll see you all, everybody, back at 10:15. Thanks.
We're going to get started, folks.
Yeah, if everybody can, in the room can come back to the tables, and then hopefully those online are still online. And we can, we can pick up where we left off. So thanks, everybody. I thought of during the break on various logical ways to organize things on topics of documentation versus implementation versus flexibility and such. I'm not sure any of that quite worked in the end, but I have a potential grouping I can run by people, but I'm also very open to hear anybody else's thoughts on how to organize the writing of responses to the 14 subparts of 6, 7, and 8. Anyone have any immediate suggestions, either online or in the room? All right, let me just then to start the ball rolling. Given roughly the number of people and a potential way to organize these, the idea is that we are of course not going to get some perfect mapping of different questions onto topics that makes everything neat and clean and ideal, and then we're done. But that it might save some trouble if we cluster some of these together rather than have 14 largely independent answers, which then have to be harmonized, and there's a lot of duplication and redundancy and overlap. So if this doesn't work, that is totally fine. But I was thinking perhaps we could take the first two from 6, which are the contents and sources of data input to BenMap. Are these transparent and appropriate? And are the inputs appropriately indicated for selection and implementation? As documented in the reference literature, group those with 7B, which is technical implementation and transparency. Is that documented clearly and describing how the results are calculated? So this would be kind of nothing about users' ability to change what's there, nothing about can we interpret the results and get the right uncertainty. It's largely this question of, is it clear when somebody goes to use BenMap what the existing BenMap tool is doing? Can people track the documentation? So that would be a cluster of 3 related to responding to how well what it's doing already is documented. And B like boy.
7B.
Yes, on documentation, and 6A and B, Alpha Bravo, also on kind of documentation.
So we're looking for a volunteer.
I don't know if we want to go through, I thought I would maybe go through the straw person grouping and then see if people are comfortable with that or want to suggest changes, and then we could look for volunteers. So 7C, sorry, I'm trying to go in order, but I'm 6C, that'll be the next one. Is the information provided to judge the sources and quality of the data? And that seems to me that it would have the largest potential overlap with 8A, which is, can the user make appropriate analytical choices? So again, these will be written as separate responses to each charge question, but if the same person was looking at those two, I thought that might minimize overlap. So that would be, essentially the kind of things that, I'm trying to remember who was proposing different ideas this morning, but maybe it was, I think it was Michael who was saying, is there some indication of quality of these things, right? The user can choose all of these choices, but how do we know if they're making appropriate choices? Can the user judge the quality of the underlying data and make appropriate choices? So that would be another group.
6C and 8A.
6C, like Charlie, 8A alpha. And then continuing through 6D are the concentration response functions appropriately implemented, documented, and referenced. And 7A are the results correctly calculated given the technical descriptions, which seem to me that these are kind of the things that came up when we were talking this morning about, can we actually figure out what the code is doing? And so the answer in there might include, well, it's not yet open source model, so the best of our ability, maybe we think so, but we don't know. And maybe that's a recommendation to make the code available, but we can at least address what we can. So that would be 6D, David, and 7A alpha.
May I offer a clarification?
Sure.
Just FYI, the source code is currently publicly available. There's an email to some GitHub links, but currently only our team has the authority to add code to those sections.
Super, thank you. Okay, I was not aware of that. So that should enable us to go farther anyway. It's always, even with public source code, it can be a challenge to know if, if there are any bugs. Okay, continuing 6E, right, the last subpoint under 6 has EPA appropriately characterized the capabilities and limitations. To my mind, that has a lot of overlap with 7D like David and E like Edward, which are the results useful and appropriate. I'm a little less sure about that one, but E, potential biases and uncertainties have been appropriately indicated. And also 8D, like David, can the user appropriately interpret and present results? That's the kind where I thought there would be the most possibility of us writing a bunch of similar text in response to questions that really span all three of these, 6, 7, and 8.
6E plus 7D is in dog, plus 7E is in egg, plus 8D is in dog.
That's right. So all 4 of those related to the characterization of uncertainties and the user's ability to interpret what they're getting out. And then that only leaves 2. One is an isolated one, 7C, like Charlie, results are presented clearly with adequate explanation. And, I suppose there's the possibility of grouping that in with the last one. I don't have a strong opinion about that if others do. And 8B and C together seem to me related to the question that was brought up several times in this morning's discussion of how much a user is able to do things that they would like to do with BenMap that might not necessarily be what regulatory analysis needs, but the research community or somebody wants to revisit the way they used to do things and so compare with prior work or do something novel, etc. So I would suggest we group 8B, Bravo, C, Charlie. Any objections to that? Okay, that would require, now if I've counted properly, was it 5 or 6? Now I kind of lost track.
5 is what I've got.
5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I keep getting 6, but I might have.
What did I do?
Okay, no, 7C, I was
Separate.
Was on its own there.
Okay.
Right. So 7C is a little bit of a lost.
Orphan.
Yeah, a little bit of an orphan, but that's all right. if somebody
True.
thinks that that should go in this larger grouping, that's fine too.
One
Yeah,
quick thought
yeah,
is that
sure.
the I forget which grouping, which cluster it was, but one had like 4 of them. But I was thinking
Yes.
8D and 7C, another option is to split that off. So that just has 2 questions, and whatever one 8D was in
Yes.
could be removed because that one had 4.
Yes, it
you know.
does. You're
So
right.
Just thinking about like splitting loads a little
Bring
bit.
8D down to 7C.
8D
Yeah.
and 7C together
Great.
because it's both about the results
I like
being presented
yeah.
clearly, and that's partly about interpretation too.
Thank you.
I like that suggestion, Matt. Thank you. Yes, I was thinking of putting C and 7C in that group, and I thought, no, then it's 5, and it gets this is great. 3 and 2 instead of 4 and 1. Okay. I'm not seeing anyone either like protesting greatly in the room or shutting off their Zoom and saying this is a terrible idea. So I'm gonna assume people are okay with this. And as always, we will now try to get leads, but realize that the leads are simply what is that funny expression that people have, the highest amongst equals or something? First amongst equals. Yeah. Okay. So everybody will continue to contribute to all these, and it looked like we had a lot of already well thought out responses to these questions. So we have a lot of input for all 3 of these, for 6, 7, and 8. So if we group them this way, we have actually, I think, fewer clusters of questions than we do team members assigned to these. But that's okay too, since again, the lead is just nominally getting everything together. So maybe we could go through these in order of, how we just did the clusters. And for those who were perhaps not, I'm not sure for the online folks who was able to join all of our discussion yesterday. But several of the people who are members of the panel assigned to 6, 7, and 8 have already taken on some of the lead duties from yesterday's questions 1 through 5. So I would hope we could also try to keep this distribution, relatively balanced, and maybe get some of the people, especially who haven't already agreed to be leads on 1 through 5, to join for 6, 7, and 8. So I guess the first one then would be this cluster that is really focused on the documentation of the existing BenMap tool, which includes 6A and B, Alpha Bravo again, and 7B Bravo. And that's really, yes, documenting how the results are calculated, documenting the sources of input, the data transparency, inputs appropriately indicated, implemented as documented. So it's really kind of this question of, can the user follow what's there, and is it clear where the references are and where the data came from, why it's there and such. So we had actually a bunch of comments about how that could be improved this morning even, which is I think a good start. Any volunteer for the documentation cluster? I guess I can call it that.
I haven't led anything like for early charge questions, so I can do this one.
Thank you very much, Lane. Okay, terrific. Okay, so let's, oh good, now on the physical page, it's all on one page, which makes things easier. Okay, so the next one would include 6C, like Charlie, and 8A, Alpha. And this is really about when somebody is using BenMap, is there enough information to make appropriate analytic choices and to judge the sources and the quality of the data, so that I guess we can begin to edge toward that bit about interpretation. But it's really, is there enough ability? So it's beyond the documentation of what is there, but to a little bit more of a question of how the user should potentially use what's there, right? So instead of just saying this is a population data set from the American Community Survey, right? A little bit more about here are your three choices, and this is what it means to choose A versus B versus C. So
I was gonna say it's kind of related to like what's being documented, and now I can do both if there's but Michael, if you want to leave, I don't mind.
I'm happy to take on one of these. So I'll take on this one if that's okay, and then I can work with Ling to coordinate anything that needs coordination.
That's great, and of course, feel this attempt again to group these is to try to make it a little easier for the leads to avoid redundancy and trying to have duplicative work. But if it ends up not working well for you, you can just go over each question. We have to remind everybody we will submit in the end a response that doesn't include clustered responses, but responds to each question in order. So if you find this useful, then that's great. And if not, that's okay too. You can disregard. So thank you, Michael. So then we have two questions related to implementation, technical implementation, and that is 6D, like David, which is more specifically focused on the implementation of the concentration response functions. And then 7A, like Alpha, which is a broader question, but essentially is the same thing. Are the results correctly calculated based on the technical descriptions, which of course includes, are the concentration response functions being implemented and calculated correctly, but as well as the rest of it, multiplying by population and baseline vulnerability and all these things. So given what we just heard from Dr. Maniloff, that the code is open source, that is the kind of thing that somebody could have a look at. Maybe somebody already has, but to the best of our ability, that would be checking whether we think it's doing what it should be doing. Anyone keen to assemble the group input for that one?
I don't feel particularly called, but I only got one assignment yesterday. Of the different clusters, this is the one I feel like I'm not going to look at. I don't know. Is anyone going to be looking at source code? I'm not going to be aligned by source code, just to be transparent.
Okay.
I looked at the source code and I couldn't actually find the part of it where they were actually doing the calculation. I mean, like there's a lot of code and only a little bit is the actual math.
But I'm happy to run point.
But maybe if it could be useful if someone could send us like, these are the lines of code specifically that are doing, because a lot of it's just like web server stuff.
Yeah.
That's a good idea, Chris. Yeah. So maybe we can, I mean, I think that applies a little bit more broadly as well, that when we have questions about BenMap that are things that we might be a little puzzled about or not sure if there is a documentation of something, we just haven't found it. I think we should, if you are willing, reach out to Dr. Maniloff and Dr. Pham. Yeah. Okay. So that's great. So thank you, Peter. That's wonderful. And that gets us to our two questions related to uncertainty and characterizing capabilities and limitations kind of thing. So the first one of those is 6E, which is essentially what I just said. Has EPA appropriately characterized capabilities and limitations? And that one is combined with 7D, like David, and E, like Edward. Are the results useful and appropriate for the intended purposes? And are there potential biases, have the potential biases or uncertainties been appropriately indicated? Right, so it's essentially all about, is it clear to the users what the limitations and uncertainties are associated with what they're getting out when they use a tool like BenMap? So again, 6E, 7D, and 7E. We have a volunteer for those.
I'll volunteer for that.
Wonderful. Thank you, Scott. Wonderful.
Thank you.
So that leaves, all right, there's two more. The second one that's kind of related to that topic is 7C, like Charlie, and 8D. And essentially that it's the results are presented clearly and with adequate explanation, is 7C for the transparency of the calculation. And 8D, like David, is everything about the tool, allow the user to appropriately interpret and present the results. So those are pretty broad questions, right? But when the user finally gets something, hey, my run finished, and now I have all this stuff. Do we know what it means? Can the user follow it? Are the results presented in a clear way? Not so much about the uncertainty, which was that previous cluster, but is it clear what's given there when you get your output? We had several comments about that this morning about, even things like units, and I think there is room for improvement. So 7C and 8D, presentation appropriate. Ted, thank you.
Thank you.
The last one, then, if I haven't lost count, which is entirely possible, is 8B, Bravo, C Charlie, which is really about the user being able to go beyond the regulatory analysis and do things that they are interested in. David.
Yeah, I'd love to take that one on. Thanks.
Wonderful. Okay. I think we are in a good position here, and we did have some really interesting comments and discussion this morning about ways to further improve BenMap. I guess I would just second what several of the panelists mentioned, is that a big thank you from the non-government community to the EPA staff for making a tool like BenMap. It's really, we don't use it in my research group, but we compare with it all the time, and it really is kind of the benchmark for everything. So it's really terrific to have it out there, and I think there were some very creative and interesting ideas about, kind of expanding the academic government partnership on this. So I hope we might be able to follow up on those even after the SAB review is done. Okay, perfect. That leads us to our final two charge questions, which are questions 9 on the future and peer review, and question 10 on future developments, which I'm quite glad that you guys asked. And these are well outside things that I think about very often, but I'm actually looking forward to hearing what the other panelists have to say about these, because they're really kind of fascinating topics. So why don't we start, logically with 9, since that comes before 10, and we will, just to read, since this one's short and only doesn't have any subparts, the entire question is just please comment on what types of changes the SAB believes warrant subsequent peer review of the BenMap software. That's it, one question. So crisp and clear, we have 5 team members from our review panel that were assigned to that question. And so I think maybe we can just go straight down the list, if that's all right. And we'd hear first from you, David, for your thoughts.
Sure, this is not necessarily something I think about all that much either, but so I don't know how much useful suggestions I can make, but just a few thoughts. It seems to me that changes and updates to BenMap generally follow changes to the PM and ozone ISAs, which I understand are peer reviewed when there are new releases of the ISAs. So it seems like peer review for BenMap updates that are just updating the latest science based on the ISAs would be redundant and unnecessary. Again, that's my fairly naive view of things. But on the other hand, more structural changes to BenMap, like the shift to the cloud-based model, or anything else that kind of diverges from the ISAs. It's not just that seems like that would warrant peer review, like we're doing now. And I guess that's all the thoughts I have now. I may have more thoughts after listening to what other people have to say. Thanks.
Great, thank you, David. Let us continue down the list. That would be Jonathan next, please.
Yeah, so I guess with this one, like I took a little bit of an issue with how the question was worded a little bit, since like the science is constantly evolving. So I kind of assumed that the baseline should be that BenMap evolves alongside the science, and like not changing is as much of a choice as changing. So, but I guess within that, it's kind of hard to I guess did you all, in running this question, did you have any, like, what types of changes are you thinking about that's like in scope?
We didn't have anything detailed in mind. So changes to the science include that we referenced, changes to the design of the tool, interpret it broadly.
Okay. And I guess within the definition of science, is that like the epidemiology or like any of the underlying data?
Any of the underlying data.
Okay. Yeah. So I guess I think with this then, like it's, I don't know what the right choice of process should be, but maybe going with the ISP process could be a start as far as the pollutants go, but I guess it'd be nice to see, kind of similar to my other comments, like a similar effort to make sure that the population data is up to date, uncertainty properly evaluated, and all of that. And along similar to that, similar process for the underlying baseline health data. And I guess similar like making sure that BenMap can track alongside developments in terms of like resolution of the existing atmospheric models and basically all the other inputs.
Thank you, Jonathan. Next will be our other Jonathan, all right?
Yeah, thank you. I think that as far as the updating for peer review, I would certainly want to start with the PM speciation. And as that science moves forward, that will become, I think, extremely important to be tracking that. Another one is as climate continues to exacerbate, we're going to go into uncharted territory. So what are atmospheric chemical processes at extreme temperatures and extreme mixing, like heat domes and, new territory that we just have not been in. So I think I'm wondering about those physical changes in atmospheric chemistry. And then another thing we've talked about before, certainly as we learn more about co-pollutants, there's a lot of data, satellite data now that's available that's giving us more information. I'm thinking about combining with SO2. So I think, you know, those three things, PM speciation, climatic extremes, and co-pollutants.
Thanks, Jonathan. That's very interesting. Yeah, that's very. Okay. Ted, please.
Yeah, maybe not as much when, though somewhat when. I would say that the next review should actually be done in tandem with the review of an output where they've actually used the study, or at least certainly after that first study's done using the new version, because there's so much you can just glean from seeing how it's been utilized. And the other thing, I mean, I would have volunteered for the question that Peter took on, except there was no way I was going to delve into the source code. So I also might suggest, you know, in terms of the next review, having a group that is capable and, you know, might even be paid to go into the source code just to see that it's actually implemented. You know, people have looked at EPA has done much more in-depth reviews on some of their, in the past. I look at some of the air quality modeling reviews where they've actually gone into more detail. You know, that you've got someone who's going to spend fair amount of time. You know, just I brought up earlier this morning how the Monte Carlo analysis was being done. That that might just take, and maybe Peter's going to do it, a separate review just to make sure that that's correctly implemented, particularly if you start bringing on different concentration response functions. But that might be something more minor as such. So that's where what I'd be looking at.
Thank you, Ted. And Scott Spack online, please. Last one.
So there's a clear need to update the peer review as the science changes and as regulatory purposes and practices change. And in the 5 to 10 year time horizon, we should expect that will include, I'll echo, the speciation and the combined co-pollutants, and also that the arrival of geostationary satellite products with high time and space resolution that will likely be added as regulatory and scientific inputs to BenMap. There's also the maturity of the sensitivity modeling in CMAC and other chemical transport models, and the reduced form models that can be used as input to BenMap. And so a timeline and process for including those types of development in the upstream, not necessarily products, but models and model infrastructure would be useful. I think beyond peer review, there's a large role of folding more into the technical guidance that doesn't necessarily require peer review, but that's more of the incremental every year or every 2 years as BenMap has been doing updated technical guidance. And that will include the future incidents, concentration response, population projections, the full air quality data baselines and policy standards for comparisons, anything that happens in the Office of Environmental Justice and their mandates, and especially community applications. And so there's a much larger role for subsequent technical guidance, I think, than there is for peer review, and that the peer review just needs to consider the known new products coming through the pipeline that are upstream of BenMap to be able to incorporate them effectively as those things are able to then inform agency regulatory analyses.
Thank you, Scott. Great. So I thought that there would be some interesting ideas about, our future for both 9 and 10. So as I said, I'm not disappointed by hearing some of these interesting things like the geostationary satellites, which I hadn't been thinking in the new heat dome conditions, things like that. I want to open this up to anybody who was not specifically assigned this question, but has input to offer to the discussion. Any other comments? Rob, please.
So just two thoughts echoing some of the discussion from yesterday in terms of new inputs available that might have a big impact on the benefits. And that's this notion of commuting and information from the transportation sector that I think could be incorporated and could have a substantial impact on what the population exposure and burden would be. And then the other one, just for, in terms of priorities, this notion of spatial resolution of the different inputs into the model. And I think, we're increasingly good at getting very fine resolution exposure data. And, the population data, from the census, you can get pretty complete information at the census tract level. Even some things at the block group level without some of the covariates that you need. But there's, I think that's probably less high resolution quality data than what we can get from the exposure data now. So that's maybe a more important source of error and uncertainty. And then the third level is the outcome data. And that's terrible right now. It's at the county level. So there were, I don't think we came up with any solutions to that yesterday, but I think that should be a, in terms of where the errors are and where the big uncertainty is, I think that could be, you shouldn't forget that as, maybe there are other people who've thought about how to get better spatial resolution for those data. Because I think if we have really good quality information that goes into the model at these sort of the other inputs into the model, we've got really poor spatial information on the outcome, then that's a limitation, and I would think some effort ought to go into improving that.
Thanks, Rob. Peter?
Yeah, I want to echo a couple points. One is anything related to treatment of uncertainty. It's probably worth getting some broader input on. Environmental justice has been mentioned a couple times, but I want to note that some seemingly innocuous choices around spatial resolution and demographic data can have huge importance for the success of those studies. And so getting input on those, especially because it's really a rapidly evolving kind of area. The third and last thing I wanted to mention, not my area, but yesterday there was a lot of discussion, dissatisfaction around valuation of morbidity and cost of illness. And there were some interesting suggestions about, ways to make things better, even in the absence of having, perfectly good willingness to pay studies on those things. But that's for sure a non-trivial thing to do, and doing it well, I think, would benefit from input. And I think EPA would, before doing a big overhaul like that, would probably want to have the blessing of the broader science community.
Any other? Okay, I'm not seeing any other comments at the moment. I would like to make one additional comment here, which is maybe it's spending too long in government. I'm thinking less of specific changes that go solely into BenMap, and thinking slightly in the other direction, that another change rather than a change in BenMap would just be a passage of time that should mean that the scientific community should review BenMap to see if you guys have kept up, even if you haven't made any changes. All right, so we've heard a lot of changes that are potentially in the future, speciation, change of cost of illness to moving away to something better, right? You might make changes that are substantive, and I think we've got a nice list of those. But I think there should also be some minimum, every 5 years or something, get the community together and say, hey, are you still up to date with the science? Maybe you haven't changed anything, so you don't think it needs review, but maybe we think actually you should be changing something. So it seems like people are suggesting kind of the scale of changes. They're the big things, right? If you make a small change in the population input or the exposure response function beta coefficient, right? I don't think anybody's saying, okay, that everything has to be re-reviewed. But we have some very good suggestions about some of the large scale changes, which I think it's probably better to give examples like this than try to define some threshold, because I don't know how you do that. Sounds pretty clear. Okay, so we have 5 people assigned, which is great. I think if we get those input from those 5, and then anybody else naturally is welcome to join in and provide input as well. And so could I again ask for a volunteer if somebody, or we could look at Holly's master list. I haven't kept it track in my head of, who's getting overburdened and who's not, but maybe we could just start with seeing if anybody's of those 5 is happy to, or at least willing, even if unhappy, willing to serve as our lead for peer review.
You're talking about 9 and 10
Yes,
together?
no, just 9, just 9. I don't know if we have. Yeah, I think everybody on this list has at least one already. So it is sort of asking if somebody wouldn't mind just coordinating a second one.
I'll take this one.
Thank you.
Well, we got 2 volunteers there. Who are you
I heard
thanking?
Scott- I heard Scott Spack. Who else?
David, but
I'm happy to defer. I only have one other thing, but if Scott is willing to take this on, I'll give input.
I got 3 volunteers.
well, we could potentially take up David's offer and see if Scott might be interested in 10, since you're also assigned to that one. If that's okay. That okay? All right. That seems
What'd you
okay with
say?
everybody. So we'll go with David for 9, and we might draw on Scott's willingness for 10.
Okay.
Terrific. Okay, so let's turn to 10, in fact, which is another one of these where we get to do what, as a scientist, I like doing, is thinking about interesting future questions, like we just did for 9. Yeah, I would be thrilled to see, something like Jonathan just suggested of BenMap including climate change in the future. But maybe that's wildly outside of scope. But I'm glad the topic came up. I think it's pretty cool. So let's turn to 10, which is not so much about future science and new geostationary satellites and climate change and all that kind of stuff, but future computer science. And the question, again, since it's short, I can just read it for anybody who hasn't memorized these. Please discuss any emerging trends in software development, computer science, or data management technologies that should be considered or prioritized for future upgrades to the BenMap software or similar tools. So we had 4 of our panelists asked to look into this one. And so again, we can go down the list, and that would be starting with Ling online, please.
Myself is not a software engineer, but I did participate a few web tool development. Most of them follow this like front end, back end kind of fashion. I think BenMap as a modeling system is useful for both like its code and its data. And if we could separate this to make the code like public available. Some of the data is not public available, that's okay. But if the data can be stored separately and the code only have access to like a certain types of data and define its it's like object oriented kind of programming. As new data types pops up or new data types pop up, it can use the functionality to deal with certain types. So if we separate that, it will give the users a lot more flexibility, as well as increasing the flexibility for updating, adding new modules in the future versions. I think some of the architecture that can be considered, for example, there's some increasing popularity of this architectural style called REST. It's called, which stands for Re-Representational State Transfer. I can probably share some link of this, but it's providing standards between computer systems on the web, making it easier for systems to communicate with each other. And the REST architecture, also called like a RESTful system, is characterized by how they are statelessly separate the concerns of a client and a server. So I think the cloud version is taking the kind of computational burden out of the client's equation, right? Basically, we don't have to install things on our computer. It may, we don't have to deal with like the computing environment discrepancies. So my user experience with BenMap a lot of times is like I have to manually upload, and then I have to like log back in and download. So if we could separate that, and having API does the job, and we could operate the data and control on our computer, but let the computation, the actual computation happening on the web, that would be great. I felt like that would, then I can use my laptop for intensive computation without like it happening really on physically on it. So that's one thing I want to mention for future software development. The other is, oh yeah, I kind of touch upon this like a flexible user definition of the grid system, population and valuation functions. And also like implementing by separating the client with the web server, we could also easily implement the batch process easily, right? So when we don't have to go upload individual files, we can upload a batch of them, which will store in the data part of the modeling system, and then make use of it using a batch script to run the model. I also like Chris' idea of making the backend open and well documented, so that we could engage the research community to do the job for EPA if you make it accessible and easily interpretable. So EPA, like I understand your resource constraint, but like grad students need to do their dissertation, and they will be very much willing to do it for you without even being paid. I'm pretty sure, like if you make it accessible.
That's great, Ling. Thank you. And that echoes some comments that Rob had made and Jonathan had talked about, bringing this user community in. So it's somewhat of a trend in people and computer science there. Terrific. So let's go on to Ted, please.
Maybe being one of the old guys, I don't have as much to say on the emerging trends. I would just sort of flip it on its head to say, things like having the more flexible shape files, et cetera, I think just have to be in there. I think we've talked about that. Still supporting NetCDF, and really still, let's not look too much to the future in that still supporting the desktop version or whatever version of BenMap that's currently there. So I just would support making sure we don't jump too far ahead without making sure we're using what's there correctly and it still has the capabilities we want and they can currently be there.
Yeah, a good point. Thanks, Ted. We'll turn next to Scott online, please.
So the things to consider and prioritize immediately are those preprocessors, as Ted mentioned, and integration and interoperability with existing data sources. And another big component is the fair data, findable, accessible, machine readable, shareable data, and with standards. And one of the great attributes of BenMap is that up to date have been that the log files include all of the data, all of the parametric choices, all the structural choices, and that's there in the new version, but they're not yet machine readable. In CMAC and other upstream data sources, there's very clear fields, and it would be a minor set of changes to the current log file to be able to include standards and able to make this machine readable as well as readable by people. And so prioritizing that soon and prioritizing the preprocessor soon is an important point to support the ongoing use. Moving forward, I think the opportunities for data assimilation and combining not just running with models or monitors or satellites, but combining models, monitored data, satellite data, citizen science data collection, commercial and open source big data of people commuting so that you can get those exposure fields. The adjoint and linear tangent CMAC DDM models and sensitivity studies, moving toward a future where regulatory and scientific and community use may involve combining many sets of input data. I think BenMap is the point at which that is most likely to happen in the scientific efforts. And so seeing that as a future application is important. Supporting sensitivity studies, source code documentation, and automation. I think preparing BenMap for AI, the model source code is well prepared for this. I can easily have, and I tried to have ChatGPT automatically document the source code. It did a good job of that. It will be easy to have AI do sensitivity runs, automate analysis, scale services if I install this on my own desktop. And so I think you're well prepared in the code to be able to do that, and just realize your user community will be doing that. And I think it's more of the guidance from SAB is BenMap is the world leader in its field. There's really no direct comparison. And the name of the game now, especially under resource constraint, is regulatory activity and community. And this is a community that has a model that has much higher interest than for other EPA models. and much lower barriers to entry than Models 3 or CMAQ. And so there's an opportunity for having a really large and vibrant user community contributing code, data, analysis, options, and prioritize making the most of that community development and extension role moving forward, echoing what prior panelists have said.
I just have one question, Scott. Can you get ChatGPT to write our report?
Yes, as long as we can train it to write in the exact language specifications, then
Yeah,
yes.
sure. Okay, thank you.
We can feed it past SAB reports so it will learn the appropriate style.
Yes.
Right? Thank you.
Microsoft Teams.
Yeah, it's kind of funny when you get to a science talk though, because it gets lost on all these, the Phanerozoic comes out to like fans of the zodiac or something. You're like, what? It's really, yeah, it can be really amusing. Okay, we have, thank you, Scott. Chris is our last input here, assigned input here, please.
Yeah, so I'll try to limit suggestions to things that might save time overall rather than requiring more effort overall. So probably the main thing that I would suggest is the addition of unit tests to the source code. So I may know what that is already, but the idea is that you want to kind of split up the code into the kind of the main functional units of what it does, and then write software tests that say, give your function or algorithm some inputs, and then see what outputs it gives, and compare those against what the output should be based on your kind of hand calculation of what the algorithm should be doing. And so adopting that would have a couple of benefits. One would be that in general, it makes it a lot faster to develop the code, because otherwise when you make a change, sometimes you make some change and it'll have unintended effects that will break other things. If you have unit tests, you just run the unit tests after every change and make sure that nothing broke. A second benefit of having unit tests is that it kind of encourages you to think about organizing the code in a way that makes it easy to understand individual parts, right? Because if all these things are kind of very closely integrated together and you have all of these kind of systematic dependencies, that it's hard to write unit tests. And it's also hard for an observer to understand what's going on. It's also harder to make changes to it because all these things are integrated everywhere. And then the third reason to have unit tests is that it would make Peter's job easier, right? Because, now Peter is going to have to read through, I don't know if it's like 1 million lines of code or something like that. And he's going to have to read through every one of those in the next 10 days and really see if and see if they're all correct. If there are unit tests, he would just be able to, run the unit tests and then go through and like verify that actually that what was written into the unit test is what should be the actual answer. Right, so that's like the main thing. A couple of other things I already mentioned, and other people have mentioned, adding documentation to the source code. And then also kind of a trend in software is like having the documentation and the code kind of together, so that, and a benefit of that is it makes it easier to kind of have this kind of rich documentation that's accessible from the tool itself. But also it makes it easier to keep the documentation updated. So like probably what happened this time is you had like some people write the software and then maybe either the same people or other people write this 300-page document, right? And then, if you make changes to the software, it's like, well, which pages in the document do we need to update? Whereas if the documentation is just right next to the code itself, you can just update the document, update the code, and then right at the same time, you update the documentation. And then there's typically a system that then kind of compiles all that into some sort of website or something like that. Or it can be a PDF if you have constraints about what the format needs to be for the documentation. And then, so another thing, which is kind of in decreasing order of importance, is that it seems like, so there's this BenMap CE was written in C#, and then we have BenMap BenMap server, which is written in Java. So there's this presumably large effort to rewrite all of the code from BenMap CV into Java. And like, presumably there was a good reason to do that. But one thing would be to think about, like, if you make, if you redo this again in the future, what can you do to avoid having to rewrite the entire code base, into a different language or whatever. And one way to do that is that kind of, if you kind of do the things in a way that you can have these unit tests, it's kind of, you have these modular components that you can then just like call from your other system or whatever, rather than having to rewrite the whole thing. And then another thing is that I have a concern that just based on, I tried to make a similar type of system. I mean, not the same, but like a similar spirit. And what happened was that the number of users that it got kind of outstripped my ability to pay for the server costs. And I know EPA has more resources than I do, but you still may run into this problem just based on some of the reminders that you've been giving us about resource constraints. And so one way to deal with that is that there's a trend to, at least for some things, to actually go away from these central web servers towards running calculations in your browser. And so, by kind of you implement the logic of your BenMap, for example, in the web browser code. And so normally, like in the past, you would have to do that in JavaScript, and it doesn't work because JavaScript is too slow, especially if you're doing like array computations. However, now, more recently, there's something called WebAssembly, which is basically a way to make code that can run fast in your browser. And you do this by writing it in some other language and then just compiling it into WebAssembly. And it turns out that Java is one of the languages that you can compile into WebAssembly. So you could consider, once you have this system where you have this kind of software library and you have these kind of just functions you can run to do the different functionality of BenMap, you could just compile that into WebAssembly and then embed it in the code in your browser code into the front end, and then you could have potentially the same interface, but just instead of sending a request to the server to run, it would just run in the browser, and then you wouldn't have this kind of centralized bottleneck. And then the final thing, this is like just, I feel like I have to say it, but I don't know if this is going to be a useful comment, but Java, like if for doing scientific computing tasks, Java is usually not the first choice. For that, usually like people would use Python. And the reason for this is because there's a lot of functionality in Python that can be shared among all kinds of different scientific computing tasks, things like array computations and mapping and things like that, that you may have to build from scratch in Java. But if you've already done that, then it may not be that useful, but just something to consider for the future.
Terrific. Peter, you're going to volunteer for something else? More source code?
No. So I want to start by saying that, broadly speaking, I like all these sorts of ideas about user groups and open source. And I say that because I'm about to sound like a grumpy old man. So I just want to make sure that like we carefully think through one thing, which is, because of the context of BenMap and its use in regulatory impact assessment, where the stakes are very high, the requirements for everything to be, correct, and quality assurance and potential court challenges and so on. I want to make sure that we recognize in the discussion EPA's needs in those regards, because I'm having sort of some nightmare scenarios where EPA's gets in trouble with a regulatory impact assessment because some part of the BenMap tool got crowdsourced to a PhD student in the basement of one of our buildings who did something because in the research world we don't always deal with those kinds of things. And so I think there's a lot of good ways to navigate those tensions. I think for a long time I was involved in the geochem community. I think they're a good example of having a really robust user group, but also some very tight version control and QA, QC. I don't know if exactly what if they would call them unit tests, but I think they're basically a unit. Okay, but similar kinds of benchmarking every time there's version control. And the other thing sort of along these lines, several people have said about, the value of BenMap as kind of approved tool and set of methods that we can say has, the blessing of SAB and peer review and EPA and all these things. I'd want to make sure that as we do that, we think carefully about clearly distinguishing between like the vanilla default blessed approved version of BenMap and and all the myriad variants that the research community will come up, so that it's clear when people are using kind of the approved stuff. And so I just want to make sure that sort of tension between quality assurance, the approved tool and method is sort of appropriately balanced against, the desire to tap into the research community, be nimble and so on.
I can maybe respond to that. So one thing that you can do is you can have your BenMap tool that's only has, code from EPA contractors or whatever in it. But if you package that in a way that it can serve as a building block in the open source community, then you can have an ecosystem that grows around it, where grad students may make their something that they build on top of it, or they may make some sort of change that is not designed to be incorporated back into the main thing, so that you can have this kind of wall between what the code is that you're trusting and what the code is that enables the community to do what they need.
Yeah, that's a great point. And there are models for that in the science community, quite a lot. Super, Jonathan.
Yeah, and I was just kind of thinking in parallel to that, if there's like the kind of EPA official version and then like the research version, there could be a process where kind of modules of the research version can kind of go up for nomination into the kind of approved EPA process, and go through like this more formal peer review to get sort of that stamp of approval.
Yeah, I mean, that's a lot like what that's basically what geochem does. And it's a good model.
Great.
And NCAR, the National Center for Atmospheric Research, does some similar things with their climate model, getting modules from different groups. So that would in part require EPA to think about, the approval process, but it could feed back into this notion of giving you additional resources at low cost potentially. Enid.
Yeah, I mean, I may be kind of overthinking this, but one of the concerns I had was the potential for kind of misuse and the generation of data sets that serve a very personal or even more concerning a political agenda, and being able to separate those kind of departures from the original intent or original use of the BenMap tool from kind of these other kind of incarnations of the tool as we perceive it kind of achieving wider use with greater interest in some of these permutations that we're discussing. And the second issue is one that I wasn't quite clear about is it assumed that the desktop tool will be sunsetted at some point, or is that going to maintain kind of a presence? I just wanted to know what the plans are for that.
We anticipate ceasing to support the desktop tool at some point in the future.
And maybe I'll go back and sort of rephrase something earlier, but just looking at CMAC as an example, CMAC, the original architecture discussion was to make it a GUI oriented, this whole Models 3, and no one used it. And, and it's the same thing here, is that you want to make it, I think, first that people are going to use this before you actually get ahead. And, even the web-based version, you're seeing a little bit of pushback already, that the community might be just as well served with something different. So I'm not, there's probably some advances that make this different, but I just look at CMAC as an example where they tried to go a little bit too far forward too fast.
Okay, we might be getting to a natural conclusion on computational futures. I hope that this, and I think that this is hopefully a very useful contribution. We had very discrete near-term, well-defined, preprocessors and unit tests and things, as well as some kind of big picture looking out further with this user community and various ways to draw an input. So it seems that it's that may have been even slightly beyond what you intended in this question, which seemed written primarily about changes in computer science, and we're talking about kind of the user community as well as, but that's clearly enabled by the modern computer science. It wasn't a thing in the past. So hopefully this will provide a very broad spectrum of possible things for EPA to consider, and you will find that useful. And I think we already have Scott, if you're still willing to lead this one.
Gladly.
Okay, terrific. Thank you very much. And you had some great comments yourself, and we'll get the rest of this feedback from the others. And then I think we will be in pretty good shape here going forward. And I do think that this, this last one is only one of many where I hope our input will be very useful to EPA going forward, and useful to many of us who use these kind of tools, even if not BenMap directly, others. So with that, I think we have kind of got through our assignment for the day and a half, which is to get through all 10 questions. I know some people have slightly earlier than our nominal end at 12:30. So that's probably a good thing that people can get shuttles and flights and such when they need. Everybody other than Peter, who has to go and read all the source code now, so I can't leave. I think maybe just the last thing we could do here is just remind people of our next steps and timeline going forward. Maybe
Right,
Holly,
so
you
in
want
terms
to
of
do that?
next steps, I just updated the file on SharePoint with the assignments. I'll send out a new link. I mean, it's the same link. I'll resend the link. And maybe I'll attach it in case there's somebody who can't open the link. But we also will need to schedule 1 or 2 follow-up video conferences. Once we have a consensus draft report, we need to get together as a panel for you to review that and discuss that and hammer out any points of disagreement or points that aren't clear, et cetera. So that takes a while. I will be in touch by email when it comes time to schedule that. I first interviewed Drew about his schedule, and then Then we have a menu of options, and then I'll send it out on need to meet. I'm inclined to schedule 2 follow-up video conferences, because if we decide the second one is unnecessary, then we can just cancel it. It's more efficient that way, because then we just pay for 1 Federal Register notice. So as we discussed yesterday, we need you to send your individual written comments to the lead writers who are on this file on SharePoint, the file that I shared last night. And that's due March 20th. And then we need the lead writers to draft a consensus response to their assigned questions by April 3rd. My voice is going hoarse.
Right, so it gives us about 2.5 weeks for that, getting in the written comments. Many of you have already put together some written comments in preparation for this meeting. So hopefully that is quite a reasonable proposition. And then that will give each of the leads another roughly 2 weeks to put together their draft consensus response. And then, of course, we will all continue, including during these future meetings, the online rather than in person, to discuss this consensus response and ensure that it actually does reflect the consensus of the entire panel going forward, and that we avoid, too much duplication or potential inconsistencies between separate questions, which is still a possibility despite trying to cluster and organize and all of this kind of stuff. We still might get somewhat divergent things in different sections. So that the idea is by the sort of end of the spring, we will have largely completed this task, and
We'll have a first
finalize
draft.
over,
Yeah.
right? And then
We'll
we
discuss
will
it online.
be polishing and have this ready, to submit by sometime in the summer.
Right. Oh, it's yet to be scheduled. I need to send, Drew and I'll think about our schedules, and then I'll send out one of those need to meet, please vote your availability emails. And we'll select a couple of dates from there. Well, that's when we need you to send me your draft consensus response to your assigned charge question as the lead writer. Before that, by March 20th, we need you to send your individual comments to whoever is assigned to that particular charge question.
So that'll be again in the link that Holly's sending, is the
The lead
document that
writers.
has the lead writers,
Yep.
right? So you know where to send everything. So, right, these first 2 are homework deadlines for the
Yes.
20th and then April 3rd. And then we will, it never really seems to work to try to do it in person, but we'll do one of these online polls and figure out the next meetings.
Yep. Really appreciate everybody's input over the past 2 days. It's been an amazing group of experts here. I want to thank my colleague, Brian Bloomer. I know he helped recruit many of you, so I appreciate that.
Yeah. And I think so many, I understand, of course, not everybody can ever make an in-person, so no hard feelings to those who are
No.
online. It's good to see you there. Also
Yes, thank
nice
you.
to meet many people in person. So thanks for coming down to North Carolina for those who are from elsewhere. And I guess we are actually ready to.
I can't think of any more housekeeping items. No. Okay, we're going to adjourn early. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks again, Tim.
Will anybody contact us about reimbursement?
Yes. Is that the EPA travel office? Yeah, probably the same person in the EPA travel office. Right. I mean, I got my receipt this morning from the hotel. And you don't need your food receipts. That's just a straightforward per diem. I have my Uber receipts by email. Yeah.
I was contacted by somebody at EPA, Samuel Fitzpatrick, I
Sam
think.
Fitzpatrick.
And it actually seemed like he already gave me the forms that we need to submit. And I think he said they needed to be submitted by Monday. So I don't think we should
Oh.
sit tight and wait. That was my
Oh.
reading.
Yeah, I think he did. I wasn't copied on all that, but I think he did include the voucher information on one of his earlier emails.